My name is Josh Freeman. I'm a historian at CUNY here at the Murphy Institute, as well as at Queens College and the Graduate Center. I think many of you know Murphy and are, in many cases, connected with programs here, but in case you're not, there's a flyer on the seats about our labor studies degree programs, which are terrific, if I must say so myself. And if you don't know about it, please look at this. If you do know about this, give it to someone you work with or a friend who might be interested. I'm going to start things by giving a very brief little historical context for the current issues involving the right to vote. And then I'm going to hand things over to our terrific panel of speakers. You know, the history of the United States, if you step back and you look at the 200 and whatever number of years, is a story of expanding democracy, including the right to vote. You know, when the country was founded, only a small number of Americans, mostly white property-owning men, had the right to vote. But then, you know, over the succeeding decades and centuries, that expanded. Property requirements were, for voting were dropped. And then after the Civil War came the 15th Amendment, which said that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race to deny someone the vote. After World War I came another constitutional amendment that gave women nationally the right to vote. So that today, you know, almost all Americans over the age of 18, with a few important exceptions, have the right to vote, okay? But this is not, the way I described it just now, what might seem to be a simple or a straight line story. Because in fact, even as we've experienced the expansion of democracy, expanding the right to vote, we've also had episodes of contracting the right to vote, taking away the right to vote. Before the Civil War, even as more white men got the right to vote, the very few women who had the right to vote lost it, and it became more difficult for immigrants and African Americans to vote. And then in the late 19th and early 20th century came an era of a massive rollback in voting rights. And the context here was in the South, the giving of ex-slaves the right to vote, which they used to restrict the power of white landowners and political leaders to use the government as a tool of repression. And at the same time in the North, you had movements of working people, reform movements that were challenging the emerging system of industrial democracy. And looking at these movements, many people in power came to the conclusion that too much democracy was a very dangerous thing. And their response was to begin to squeeze down the right to vote. This reaction began in the South, aimed at both African Americans and also many poor whites who were pushed out of voting through intimidation, terror, and eventually laws. And starting in the 1890s, many southern states, all the southern states, passed laws that restricted voting, either through poll taxes or literacy tests or the secret ballot, which in effect meant that you had to be able to read to vote, or lengthy residence requirements, or ultimately primary elections that only whites were allowed to vote in. And in the North, and this is not as well known a story, you also saw a similar effort to push out of voting, particularly urban, working class, and immigrant voters. Again, in part by using literacy tests and poll taxes. Immigrants who often were allowed to vote before they became citizens, after they had their first naturalization papers, found those laws changed, and many laws were passed saying that if you were an immigrant, you couldn't vote unless you brought your naturalization papers with you, much like the photo ID laws we're seeing today. New laws made it difficult for third parties to get on the ballot, and banned fusion slates in many states. So we had several decades where we had a constriction of the right to vote, a movement away from democracy. And it took battles that I'm sure many of you know about after World War II to begin to win back some of those rights, to get the vote back for people like, for example, Southern African Americans who had lost that right, and to give it to others who never had it. For example, in many states, Indians were never allowed to vote in the United States, or 18 to 21-year-olds. So it was a great historic achievement to get to something close to universal adult suffrage. Convicts can't vote, ex-felons in many places can't vote, non-citizens can't vote, but pretty much everyone else, at least on paper, in the United States now has the right to vote. But very disturbingly, in the last couple of years, we seem to be seeing a new effort to roll back the vote, maybe a new sense that too much democracy is not a good thing. And that's the subject of our forum today, because this movement of new laws to make it more difficult to vote challenges us in profound ways. It not only will affect the outcome of the next election, but it really potentially could change the very nature of our whole country. So that's what we're here to talk about today, and we have a terrific panel of speakers to do that. And I am going to introduce them one at a time before they each speak. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for our questions or discussion. And then I know a lot of you do have classes to get back to and other things to do, so we will try to be pretty punctual and stop on time. There's a slight change in our program. Ryan Haygood from the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund couldn't make it, but that doesn't really matter because we have someone terrific in his place, who's Dale Ho, who is the assistant counsel in the political participation group at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. His work includes litigation under the Voting Rights Act, dealing with issues of disenfranchisement, prison-based gerrymandering, barriers to voter registration, and ballot access. And even prior to coming to the Legal Defense Fund, he was engaged with these issues as a LDF fellow at Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, where he litigated both complex commercial matters but also federal civil rights laws. He has written articles for the Florida Law Review, the Harvard Black Letter Law Journal, and the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dale Ho.
Thank you, Professor Freeman, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's an honor to be here in the stead of my boss, Ryan Haygood, who sends his regrets that he was unable to come here today. My name is Dale Ho, and I'm an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where my work centers around voting rights, mostly litigation under the Federal Voting Rights Act to protect access to the ballot, but also some policy work around various election reform initiatives. I'm going to talk very briefly today and do a quick slideshow about the wave of laws that we've seen in the last 18 to 24 months that have been passed in a lot of states that have constricted the right to vote. It's really what we view as a new assault on voting rights in the 21st century. And I'm actually going to contextualize this within the same frame that Professor Freeman was talking about earlier. The right to vote and the expansion of the franchise has been a story of progress throughout American history, but it's not one of linear progress. And for every expansion of voting rights we've seen, there's been a contraction. And I want to try to continue with that theme and tell that story, I think, through the African American experience historically and in terms of what we're seeing today in 2012. So the theme for my talk today is this quote from William Faulkner: "The past is never dead. Indeed, it is not even past." And by that I mean the historical trend that we've seen with whenever there's been an expansion of voting rights, there's always been a counteraction of contraction of voting rights. That very same sort of historical trend we see at work today. The story that I want to tell begins in Reconstruction, the 1860s, after which there was a tremendous expansion in voting rights, obviously primarily amongst African Americans freed after the Civil War. At the beginning of the 1860s, fewer than 1% of African Americans in this country had the right to vote. By the end of the 1860s, that figure was well over 80%, at least amongst African American males. The results of that were really, you could really see that translated in terms of who was being elected to office in state legislatures. Half of South Carolina's legislature was black. This is during Reconstruction. 42% of Louisiana's state house was black. 30% of Mississippi's state house was African American. And if you look at those numbers from sort of the mid-20th century, it's really an astonishing number, because this amazing progress we saw in the first generation after the Civil War was completely eliminated a generation later. By the 1890s, you saw a wave of laws passed throughout the South which essentially extinguished voting rights for African Americans in this country for nearly a century. And they used a variety of means to do that: poll taxes, literacy tests, good character examinations, felon disenfranchisement laws, which were often specifically tailored to the kinds of crimes and criminal offenses that legislators in the South thought were more frequently committed by non-whites than whites, and then grandfather clauses that prohibited these kinds of restrictions from being enforced against white Americans. We lived under that kind of regime for close to a century. It took decades of fierce struggle and scenes like this and this before we got something close to universal suffrage again in the United States. The most important, I think, milestone in that was the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which again sort of changed the face of the South and really changed what was possible as far as the exercise of voting rights for people of color in this country. Now, fast forward to the 2008 election. I think for the last few decades, we saw really an expansion of participation by people of color in our electoral process. And it really culminated, I think, in the 2008 election, which has been described as the most diverse in United States history. People of color comprised over a quarter of all citizens of voting age, which was a record. And the gap between turnout between eligible white voters and eligible African Americans nationally, now obviously there were still substantial differences in certain regions of the country, but nationally that gap almost closed. This chart shows you the growth in the minority community in terms of eligible voters by race just between the 2004 and 2008 presidential elections. And you see there was tremendous growth in minority communities. Hispanic and Latinos grew by over 20%, Asians over 12%, African Americans close to 7%, and that growth demographically translated into political power at the polls. This chart shows you the percent change in number of ballots cast between 2004 and 2008, and you see there's huge gains in terms of participation by people of color in this country, most notably Hispanics, but also Asians and African Americans, and you see that the white growth in terms of percentage of votes cast was very small between 2004 and 2008. So we're seeing record numbers of people of color participating in our electoral process, and as a percentage-wise, are comprising a greater share of the electorate than ever. And this culminates, obviously, in the election of the first African American president in our nation's history. Now, it would be very tempting to look at this and sort of say, you know, now we live in this wonderful post-racial society, all our work is done, we are the world, everyone, you know, hold hands and just pat ourselves on the back and just go home. But as we've seen throughout American history, every time there is more participation in the electorate, an expansion of voting rights, there is a counter action to that. And we see that again today. Starting last year in 2011, we have started to experience an assault on voting rights like we have not seen in a generation. There are three stages at which states have tried to interfere with the exercise of the right to vote. At the stage at which people register to vote, at the stage at which people engage in early voting or absentee voting, and then on election day itself, largely in the form of these photo voter identification laws that I think you've probably heard about. I'm going to give you some examples of each of these kinds of restrictions. But overall, just last year, 25 laws were passed in 14 states which restrict the right to vote at one of those three stages. And I'm going to give you some examples, but our report, which we have copies of at the back of the room, goes into a lot more detail about the different kinds of voting restrictions that have been passed. So if you want more information after this talk, please take a free copy of our report. This was a clip from Stephen Colbert sort of talking about some of these voting restrictions. I've been told we don't have audio, so I'm not going to play it, but I assure you it was hilarious. What actually is really remarkable, though, about this clip is he takes some footage from a guy named John Stossel, who's a commentator for Fox Business, Rush Limbaugh, and an election official in Maine. And what's really, I think, amazing about this particular attack on voting rights that we're seeing right now is people are very, very upfront and explicit about what they're trying to do. They actually say, the advocates of these laws, that they want fewer people to vote, which I think is really, really remarkable and really runs against the narrative that we tell that everyone has a voice in our democracy. But let's talk about some of these examples of these laws. So the first stage that I mentioned was the voter registration stage. And I'm going to give you an example from Florida, and this is a case that we're actually litigating right now. Florida is trying to enact severe restrictions on voter registration drives throughout the state. But before I talk about the exact nature of those restrictions, I just want to give you some sense of how important these voter registration drives are. There are substantial racial disparities in terms of who uses third-party voter registration drives. I mean, drives conducted by good government groups like the League of Women Voters and stuff like that try to get people to register to vote. Only about 6% of white Americans who are registered to vote register through one of these voter registration drives, but the rates are about 3 times as high for African Americans and Latinos, about 18% for each group. So that's what we know about voter registration drives. Here's what, and this is again after the 2008 election, this is 2011, here's what Florida wants to do with voter registration drives. Every group that wants to conduct a voter registration drive now must mandatorily register with the state. What does that mean? That means if you want to touch a voter registration form in the state of Florida and give it to someone who is not a member of your family and help that person fill that form out, you need to officially register with the state of Florida to do that. This is brought to you by the Party of Small Government. Now, when you turn that form in, when you give that form to someone and they fill it out, you have 48 hours, not 49, not 50, to turn that form in to the local supervisor of elections. And I mean that they take that 48-hour limit very seriously. I'm representing the state conference of the NAACP in Florida, and they got in trouble in Okaloosa County for turning in 2 forms 90 minutes late. They turned them in at 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. They collected them at 2 p.m. on Sunday. Now, why didn't they turn them in on Monday? Monday was Martin Luther King Day. But they still got in trouble with the state of Florida. Here's what your penalty is, $50 per form per day late. What has been the effect of this? The League of Women Voters has announced it is canceling all voter registration activity in the state of Florida because they cannot subject their volunteers to the risk of liability as a result of this. The NAACP has cut its voter registration activity about in half. And these are groups that registered thousands of people to vote in 2008. One other example from the voter registration stage that doesn't get talked about as much, but I think it's an important issue. It has to do with criminal records. People in a lot of states can lose the right to vote as the result of committing a criminal offense. But I think it's important to think about this, or at least be aware of some of the racial effects of this. So in Florida, for instance, 13% of African Americans have lost the right to vote because they have a criminal record. That's compared to, that's a quarter of all people who are disenfranchised in Florida are African American, even though African Americans are only 12% of the electorate. Now, in April of 2007, then Governor Charlie Crist signed an executive order that said, you know what, if you're a nonviolent offender, after you finish your sentence, you get your right to vote back. Florida previously had been one of the states that disenfranchised people for life if they've committed any felony offense. Governor Crist said, you know what, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You served your time, you committed a nonviolent offense, you get your right to vote back. As a result, between 2007 and 2010, 150,000 ex-offenders were restored to the voting rolls, but March 11, the new governor, Governor Scott, rescinded that. It's over now. If you commit any felony offense in Florida, doesn't matter if it's violent or not, you cannot vote for the rest of your life. And he also added some new restrictions. So that's at the registration stage. Let's talk about the second stage, the early voting stage. Florida is one of the states that has an extended early in-person voting period In Florida, that means that 14 days before Election Day, at least in the past, and this was true in 2008, you could cast a ballot in person. You didn't have to wait until Election Day, because we all know that there are long lines on Election Day, and people have a difficult time sometimes making it on Election Day. So this chart just kind of shows you, if this is Election Day, all the gray boxes are the days on which you used to be able to cast a ballot in Florida. This was an important reform that they initiated after the 2000 election, because there was a lot of mess in the 2000 election, as we all know about. So this is the 2008 early voting rate for whites and African Americans. About a quarter of white voters in Florida in 2008 availed themselves of the early voting period. More than half of African American voters who cast a ballot in Florida in 2008 did so during the early voting period. So, what does Florida do in 2011 in order to prepare for the 2012 election? This is your early voting period. First 5 days are gone. We're cutting them. They're eliminated. And we're going to eliminate early voting on the last Sunday before Election Day. Now, why is that last Sunday so important? Have people heard of Souls to the Polls churches? Right? It's a time when people go with their congregations to the polls. Well, African Americans, 12% of the electorate in Florida. They were 33% of voters on the final Sunday before Election Day. It's really remarkable. It's like they're not even trying to hide what it is that they're doing. The third stage at which they're interfering with the right to vote is on Election Day itself, largely in the form of photo identification laws. Now, this is a map that shows you in 2011 the number of states that considered photo identification laws. What's really remarkable is, before that, there were only 2 states in the country that required you to bring photo ID to the polls in order to cast a regular ballot: Indiana and Georgia. Right? Now, the rationale for these laws is there's voter fraud. What's amazing is that all of these states suddenly, after the 2008 election, think they have a wave of voter fraud. They didn't really seem to think they had that kind of problem before, which is what Stephen Colbert was talking about in this clip, but we won't talk about that. So let's talk about the effect of these photo ID laws. Right? The studies are a little varied. We're not exactly sure how many people do or don't have photo ID. The studies range anywhere from 1% to 13% of registered voters, and 11% to 16% of voting age citizens do not have a government-issued photo ID card. We know they're disproportionately minority, disproportionately poor, disproportionately young, and seniors. Let me just give you one example of these laws. This is from the great state of Texas. And I'm not picking on Texas just because my in-laws live in Texas. In Texas, this is one of the acceptable forms of ID, a concealed handgun license. You can bring that and you can cast a ballot. But what if you want to bring your University of Texas student ID card? Nope. Not an acceptable form of identification on Election Day. So it makes you sort of scratch your head. If the purpose of these laws is to prevent fraud, one might wonder why a government-issued ID card from the University of Texas would be insufficient to verify your identification. If instead your goal is to change the shape of the electorate, well, these laws start to make a little bit more sense. That's all. That's actually all I had. But I just wanted to give you a sample of some of the laws that have been passed. There's more information in our reports in the back of the room. Thank you.
I want to thank Dale and apologize for underestimating his meticulous timing, and I appreciate that. Our next speaker is Pierrette Talley, and she's come a long way to be with us, and I thank her greatly. She's the Secretary-Treasurer of the Ohio AFL-CIO. She's the first woman ever to hold one of the 2 top offices in the Ohio AFL-CIO. She's the administrative officer of the organization. She was elected to the position in 2002, re-elected in 2006. But even as she holds this position, she's continued to be a grassroots activist. And there's been a lot of mobilizations, I think we all know, in Ohio. She's been working to mobilize workers and communities around local living wage ordinances, advocating for affordable prescription drugs, fighting for a fair minimum wage, and particularly relevant for us tonight, fighting to protect the rights of Ohio voters. So I welcome Pierrette Talley.
Thank you. Good evening. I first want to thank Paula Finn and her colleagues here at the Murphy Institute. I'm so pleased to have the honor of coming and speaking at this forum on such an important topic. And I must say that the title of the topic, Who Gets to Vote, particularly with all of the challenges that have been laid out by Josh and by Brother Dale Ho, I know it's a question that we've been asking ourselves in Ohio. So as you know by now, I'm from Ohio, and we like to think of ourselves as ground zero when it comes to politics, especially presidential politics. I'm sure that you all have heard it said that in order to be elected President of the United States, you have to win in Ohio. How many heard that before? And that is true because in the last 100 years, only 2 Democrats have been elected without winning Ohio. The last candidate to do so was John F. Kennedy in 1960, and the other one was Franklin D. Roosevelt. But Richard Nixon had his biggest victory in Ohio, but it wasn't enough to put him in the White House. So, to be sure, no Republican has ever been elected president without winning Ohio. So we do take our politics in Ohio very, very seriously. Now, one thing we know is that when the stakes are high, like something like the presidency, there's always the undertow that tries to alter the power relationship in politics, as has been laid out in the background by Brother Freeman and Brother Ho. Since 2000, we've been witnessing, though, a much more vivid, concerted effort to disenfranchise what we are calling RAE voters. RAE voters stands for Rising American Electorate. Some might even call it an emerging majority. There are some reports that suggest that by 2018, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, and unmarried women will be the majority in the American citizen age population. Now, we know that in today's America, this new emerging majority, or the rising American electorate, they face inequality on many fronts. We're here to talk about voting, but in their workplaces, they earn less and face higher unemployment rates in their homes, where they're more than likely than others to face foreclosure, and in schools where they're less likely to get a high school or a college degree. Inequality that is striking at the heart of our democracy. Full voter participation is where they're really lagging. Now, according to a report that I just saw that just came out not too long ago, 2011 report of the New Organizing Institute, as the population of this new majority surges, they lag behind the rest of the population when it comes to full participation in our democracy. And so let's just look back at the 2000 election, which should have been a time to celebrate, especially if you were African American. It was a time in our history when the voter turnout increased by nearly 2 million votes. But those that would deny full participation by all of us resorted, as we know, to an all-time low, and I believe they out and out stole the election. Why? Because they know that voting does matter. And again, as been stated by the previous speakers, they're intent on contracting and not expanding the vote for all. I read that somewhere that the founder of this corporate lobbying group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. Has anyone here heard of ALEC? The founder of that group, Paul Weyrich, once said, and I quote, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now." He goes on to say, as a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down, end quote. And history kind of bears that out, that they really don't want everyone to vote. As Mr. Freeman has said, in his opening remarks, the first fight for democracy was against the monarchy. A war that was fought to guarantee that free white land-owning men over the age of 21 could vote. And then he talked about the Civil War, fought to ensure that all men, including former slaves, would have the right of citizenship, including the right to vote with the passage of the 15th Amendment. And then after that, he talked about the suffrage movement that won the right for women to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. And then there was struggle in the 1960s during the civil rights movement to ensure that newfound rights for voting were enforced by organizing the outlaw of poll taxes and literacy taxes and even intimidation. And even later on in the 70s, the struggle gave birth to a youth movement where young people became a power in this country and expanded the vote to those who were 18 and older. The one commonality of all these struggles of advancing our democracy and advancing our vote and coming from organized labor, this is a word we use often, it was organizing. What we know was that if and when we organize, we can change things. So, as been stated, with the introduction of these new voter ID laws in 34 states in the first few months of 2011, legislators effectively, through their actions, would disenfranchise tens of millions of eligible voters who don't have the kind of IDs that these new laws would mandate. And more than half a dozen states, including my own state of Ohio, they've made it more difficult to vote by restricting early voting and mail-in absentee. In the law that was passed in Ohio, they even added one more thing, Brother Ho. They added that poll workers would be prohibited from instructing voters when they were in the wrong precinct and that their vote would not count if they persisted in voting at that location. Now, we know in the last election, in the last presidential election, Ohio had a major increase in no excuse early in-person absentee voting and mail-in absentee voting when the legislature made changes in 2005. I guess that's why they came right back in 2011 and they limited the number of days for both, even eliminating altogether that very, very interesting time of voting the weekend prior to the election. These attacks on our democracy are also in part the result of the impact of money in our politics, where corporations are treated like people and the average person has fewer rights than the wealthiest in this country. And to further demonstrate the desire to contract our democracy, the same forces that have attacked organizations that have the capacity to register, educate, and mobilize voters like unions, the attack on voters, union workers, and women is no accident. So when Governor Walker in Wisconsin and Kasich of Ohio declared war on unions, they never counted on the fight back from all sectors of society who understood that they overreached, and if they came for the public sector workers, who would be next? Oh, and what about the Susan Komen Foundation? They're supposed to be there finding a cure for breast cancer, but they targeted a group like Planned Parenthood that provides for reproductive health care for millions of poor, unmarried women. These are the rising American electorate that are the target of these voter suppression bills. We have to be part of the growing electorate who are fighting back against these attacks on our freedom to participate in our democracy. Now, in Ohio, we made history recently when we collected 1.3 million signatures to change a law that stripped public workers of our right to bargain collectively. And then we repealed the law by a margin of 61 to 39% at the polls. In the midst of that campaign, what you all may not know is that Ohioans had to again organize, and we stood against the right-wing intent on disenfranchising and suppressing the votes of hundreds of thousands in the midst of the fight. While we were fighting to retain bargaining rights for public workers, we collected enough signatures from the voters to go back to the ballot box again and repeal a law that was passed, House Bill 194. We call it the voter suppression law, and that's going to be on the ballot in November, and we're looking for the same kind of turnout. Because you see, not only did Ohioans petition for repeal of the law that was passed, House Bill 194, but we now have recent polling that shows that a solid majority of likely voters would vote to repeal this terrible law. So what I'm here to talk about is that even though we have these attacks coming at us, there's some things that we can do. We can organize and fight back, and we don't do it by ourselves in the labor movement in Ohio. We join forces with other community organizations and our allies in the civil rights community to push back on whether it's voting rights, worker rights, or other kinds of rights in Ohio. We're fighting back, and we're actually experiencing some wins. As I bring my remarks to a close, these are very challenging times that we're in. There was a time that not only did people speak of being willing to die for freedom and democracy, you all know many of them did. Today, we not only need to be willing to die for, but we need to be willing to live for and fight once again for our freedom and for our democracy. So to answer the question, who gets to vote? Everybody that's eligible gets to vote, but only if we fight for it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Our third speaker is Frances Fox Piven, who is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Political Science at the CUNY Graduate Center and here at the Murphy Institute. Her scholarship and her activism, and she's someone who combines them very much, deal with the development of the welfare state, social movements, and electoral politics. Along with the late Richard Cloward, she helped conceive and win passage of the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, better known as Motor Voter, which led to a huge boost in voter registration. Her many books over the past 35 years include Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America, published in 2006. And she co-authored in the most recent issue of New Labor Forum, a journal put out here at the Murphy Institute, an article on voting rights, which is also, that issue has an article by Steve Fraser and myself that deals on the history of this issue. So I welcome Frances Fox Piven.
Glad to be here, glad to speak with my very respected colleagues. Well, everybody here knows that the 2012 election is hugely important. Think of what it's going to be like if Mitt Romney wins the presidency, the crazy Republicans take over the Senate, they already have the House, lunacy in the highest places. So we're paying a lot of attention to the 2012 election. Now, most of the time when we pay attention to this election, we do it the way we always do it. We're watching the contest. The money contest, of course, who's raising the most bucks. And we're watching the campaign rhetorical contest, the appeals, the rhetoric, the lies, and so forth. This time, there's at least some attention to another campaign that also goes on at every important election in the United States. Most of the time, we don't pay any attention to that other campaign. That other campaign has to do with determining who gets to vote. Not how the voters will swing this way or that way, but who's going to get into the electoral arena to cast their ballot. 2008 was an election where more people got into the electoral arena and got to cast their ballot. And the evidence we have suggests that the increase in first-time voting among minorities, young people, and especially poor people, that was where the biggest increase was in first-time voters, that these increases did put Obama over the top. Now, why did voting increase among these voters? Well, partly it was the excitement for, especially for minority voters, of an African-American candidate. Partly it was the rhetoric. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Partly it was the desperation and hope of poor people whose numbers among first-time voters actually doubled for the poor. The class turnout change was the most remarkable. But this happened in spite of the arcane complexities of election law and administration in the United States and the vast repertoire of trickery that election law, it's different in every state, it's different in every county. One law accumulates over another law, permitting all sorts of deviousness, as well as just the kinds of stuff we know in New York, longer lines in the neighborhoods where you don't want a lot of voters, make them wait, or broken machines in those neighborhoods, or you probably all know about voter challenges. This is also a very arcane thing that we allow in the United States. You can challenge, a citizen can challenge voters, or voter caging, which involves the uses of the post office to send out letters. If people don't return the card that goes with the letters, then you challenge them at the election booth. That's all long-standing. What's new right now is the press attention to some of this kind of thing. But why do we have all that stuff? So that you have to have the huge burst of effort and enthusiasm of 2008 to register and to vote. Well, there's a logic in it. It's not exactly a class logic, although it works in tandem with class politics. It's the logic of party competition in a two-party system. In a two-party system, in principle, you win by appealing to the largest number of voters, right? Well, but logically, you can also win by getting rid of a certain number of the voters that are likely to vote for the opposition. And you can calculate that easily, as you can't in an 8 or 12 in a multi-party system. Moreover, if the voters that you target for vote suppression are what historian Richard McCormick called discordant voters, if they are African Americans or Hispanics or poor people. Thank you. It's easier to target them because you can slander them. You can say, well, a lot of people have said that throughout American history. Those people have centuries of iniquity in their blood. They don't deserve to vote because they're marginals, they're lower class. Or those people commit fraud. I mean, the very act of voting is considered fraud by some people. So this is deeply entrenched in the logic of a two-party system, and the fact that it is people who are at the bottom who are targeted is deeply entrenched in the class character of our political culture. Now, mostly, I'm a political scientist, and mostly people who study American politics completely ignore this. Not only do they ignore it, they follow in the footsteps of a very eminent political scientist who I otherwise think is pretty good. He's dead. E.E. Schachtschneider, who argued, and it became a principle which everybody who taught American politics advanced, that the logic of party competition is to expand the electorate. because you want to win. So you would go out and recruit voters. Vote, 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 vote for me. But there's another logic, and that's the logic of getting rid of voters. Now, there's evidence for the fanciful argument that's made in American politics. We have made progress, Josh referred to this in his remarks, in giving the formal right to vote to more and more people. We have constitutionally enfranchised African Americans, enfranchised women, enfranchised 18-year-olds, and we boast about that when we talk about the United States as the first democracy, the exemplar of democracy that the whole world should follow. But at the same time as this happened, in terms of constitutional rights, this expansion happened, the laws and regulations and tricks that disenfranchised people also multiplied. The machinery accumulated, and so did the opportunities for trickery, chicanery that complex machinery makes possible. That's what's happening today. 2008, we had a victory in spite of the obstacles in our election system. 2010, that election was a setback. The Tea Party did very well. Republicans gained undisputed control of a large number of state governments. 2010 was an opportunity to expand the traditional American repertoire for disenfranchising voters. That's what photo ID, which has been introduced in 34 states, is about. That's what proof of citizenship required to register in some states is about. That's what efforts to eliminate election day registration, or as you said, Dale, to shorten the time for early voting, or to restrict volunteer voter registration drives. That's what that is all about. Felony disenfranchisement is in a way even worse because it's the massive incarceration of young African Americans and Latino men, mainly, is like a machine, so that high incarceration rates produce disenfranchisement. It also produces poverty among the people who undergo incarceration, and we know that poor people are usually less likely to vote. So this drama that we're witnessing, the effort to make the electorate smaller and especially make it smaller at the base, this drama is deeply embedded in the structure of American party politics and in American political culture. I want to close by talking about something that unions could do if they could make up their mind to do it. In 1993, I think Josh mentioned this, an advance was legislated called the National Voter Registration Act. The NAACP is one of the organizations in the coalition of voting rights organizations that pushed through that legislation. The idea for the legislation originated in 1983-84, where Jesse Jackson was one of the candidates for president. A lot of enthusiasm about voter registration, virtually a kind of volunteer voter registration movement. And that movement was not defeated, but really blunted badly by the capacities for resistance by local election boards, local election officials, who had this big repertoire of election rules and election deviousness to make it isn't new that you only get 2 forms to register voters as a volunteer, and you have to turn it in at the end of the day. That's what they all did, until the National Voter Registration Act was passed. It was passed over the fierce opposition of Republicans. George H.W. Bush vetoed it. Republicans, straight party line vote. It was passed despite the lukewarm support of Democrats. I mean, neither party really wants those lowlifes in the electorate. They like smaller electorates. They can manage the election campaign better. And poor people, black people, they just make trouble in the campaign. Nevertheless, it was eventually passed. And through an accidental concatenation of circumstances, Clinton was persuaded to sign it. Actually, it was an accidental concatenation of circumstances. It had to do with the fact that he was bidding for the youth vote, and there were youth groups that were like Rock the Vote that were big supporters of the legislation. So in the campaign, he promised he would sign it, and then he did. But the act, contrary to your happy version, Josh, the act was mainly not implemented. The act required, it was implemented in driver's license agencies, but the act required that everyone who interacted with staff in an agency that had to do with Medicaid or welfare or WIC or food stamps or disability, even if they were turned down for the disability service, if they had an interaction with the disability staff person, they were supposed to be offered the opportunity to register to vote. And, you know, I guess we were a little naive. We thought that because there was a federal agency that was required to collect all the records of how many people interacted with those agencies and how many people were registered, we thought the Justice Department would ride herd on that legislation. You know, state after state fills out those forms, and the form could say 100,000 people accepted for food stamps, zero registration in welfare, zero registration in WIC, and nobody does anything about it. So I'm going to end, Josh. Sit down. Nevertheless, you know, the unions have always been the public sector unions who work in the agencies where this legislation is supposed to be implemented have always been very desultory about it. They've always treated it like just more work. It's not more work. It's registering our people, bringing them into the electorate, and we have the law on our side. We should do a work to rule campaign and bring some truth to Gingrich's slogan about the food stamp president. Thank you.
You know, they don't pay me enough to be the cop, you know, so I'm going to not do it again. So, but anyway, thank all of you for terrific presentations, but I also thank you for, in fact, being extremely hewing to what we asked. So we do have lots of time for questions and discussion. And I think maybe we could do this by having one or two questions at a time, and then whichever people on the panel want to respond to them, and panelists may want to respond to each other. So let me throw it open. Let's say take two questions to get started, and we have a microphone, and since we are recording it, I think we'd ask you to speak into the mic. So the gentleman has a hand, and there's a second person. Okay, first the gentleman in the blue, and then the gentleman in the yellow.
Thanks. I suspect nobody in this room came here without believing in what they heard, even though they learned a lot of new details. They could have just read a book and learned facts. I wonder whether any of the speakers have any idea what we ought to do those of us in this room, before we go home tonight, while we're together, to figure out how we can make a difference rather than just being applauding and happy that we're here.
We often hear that working class voters, especially in the South, vote conservative. So I'm curious if these laws are going to have a backlash and maybe have the opposite effect than intended, or is that a myth? Do poor people vote more Democrat?
So let's take these two, and then we'll get another couple. Who wants to start?
If I can address the first gentleman that spoke. I think one of the things that we, in 2011, when these bad laws were we started to see voter ID laws and voter suppression laws and other kinds of bad things happening in Ohio. We almost took the position that we couldn't beat it back. Union density in Ohio is down significantly. So when they came after public sector workers with Senate Bill 5, the bill to restrict public sector bargaining, we almost kind of went into the same routine that we always go in when we're trying to fight back. But what we did, we decided to reach out beyond ourselves and do this education program with the community, with the public as a whole. We very strategically took the time to at least listen to how we should message our campaign, how we should talk about what was happening to the public sector workers. And as a result of that, we built a frame that we were actually able to organize 1.3 million people to sign the petition. Before 2011, anytime you want to repeal a bad law in Ohio, you always have the right of referendum. But we often end up having a paid campaign where we have to go out and pay for the signatures, pay people to go out and get the signatures to get the issue on the ballot. I can tell you unequivocally that 75 to 80% of the signatures we got as a result of volunteer effort, and that was educating union members that this issue was about them and educating the community that this was about them. Fast forward a couple months after we got the issue on the ballot, and they did the same thing and passed House Bill 194, which is a voter suppression bill, the way Brother Holt described, limiting early voting in person, prohibiting poll workers from helping voters. The same kind of effect happened. Rather than us fall into the same law, we took the time to educate the community on what was at stake, and they saw this as not an issue that was for poor people or even minorities, but people, genuinely thought that they wanted to push back on a legislature that they thought was overreaching. So I think the key for us was to organize and to mobilize even beyond our base, the traditional support that we normally have. And we were able to get at least 300,000 Ohioans to sign the petition. You only needed 200,000. And then as a result, we were able to get it on the ballot. And the polling already shows us that 54% of the electorate would vote to repeal that bad law. And it crosses all kinds of demographics, not just a Democratic issue. We have some Republican support and support from independents.
Overall, and in the South as well, poor people are the most democratic group in the United States, capital D. In any case, I think that, and in this sense I agree with you, I think that we have, if we're progressives, we have a natural constituency, and that natural constituency not only includes, but is based on the people who are worst off in the United States. And we have to work with those people, and we have to bring them into the electorate if we want to win elections. I would also point out that the Tea Party, demographically, is all white. It is better off than the average American, substantially better off. Tea Partiers report no financial anxiety, and it's also older. So for a progressive electorate, we want to aim at young people, minorities, and poorer people, poor and working people?
Oh, well, just one additional comment and answer to your question. I think the people who are behind these laws are they're pretty smart. They know what they're doing. The best example I think of this is the reduction in the early voting days. If you look at the academic literature from before 2008, early voters were actually disproportionately composed of more well-off people, better informed voters, more highly motivated voters. The demographic composition of early voters was disproportionately white prior to 2008. That changed dramatically with the 2008 election, and it's held true since then, which is very remarkable. So the people who study early voting are, I think, surprised by this trend. In the 2010 primaries and 2010 general elections, I can only speak about Florida because that's the only state that I've been looking at the data for since we're litigating this case. African Americans who had been a smaller percentage of early voters prior to 2008 remained early voters at a much higher rate than whites during the 2010 primary and the 2010 general, despite the fact that overall turnout in the 2010 elections for whites was much higher compared to African Americans when you compare it to the 2008 elections. So it's, I think, in reaction to that trend that we see states trying to eliminate early voting. They weren't trying to get rid of early voting before 2008. At least conservatives weren't, because it inured to their benefit. Now that it doesn't, suddenly it's too expensive, it's too costly. It's particularly on that last Sunday before Election Day.
Can I just do something a little unusual before we get to the next round of questions? But this kind of is response to the gentleman's question about what we can do. And I know, given I know Murphy students, is there anyone here who's an officer or an activist in a public sector union who might want to comment on Professor Piven's suggestion about the role that they might play in enforcement of motor voters? Does this ever come up in any of your unions? Yeah.
Marvin Holland, I'm the political director of the Transport Workers Union. We're actually doing that in conjunction with the NAACP and other community groups. We figured that we would go where we should be registering voters: poor people, unemployed people, people that are on public assistance. There's already several coalitions that we're putting together to do just that. So over the next couple weeks, you'll probably see, I know one of the coalitions I'm with is Insight New York. There's going to be several coalitions that are put together around that issue. But with that, as we register new voters, my question is, with the redistricting issue, it's a two-part question. With redistricting, particularly here in New York, with the changing demographics, there's going to be some tensions between African Americans, Latinos, between African Americans, people from the Caribbean. As these populations are growing in New York, there's a shift. So my question is, and perhaps it's going to be difficult for people up there to answer, but how do we keep our long-standing coalitions we have together in New York? Because as we register new voters, as we do that type of civic engagement work, what we find is that the demographics are shifting, and the powers that are now, the people that are in power now will not be there a couple years, 5 years, 10 years from now.
Well, great question. Why don't we take a response to that now, and then we'll get to the next round.
Well, that mainly has to do with local representation. It has to do with councilmanic races. It has to do with assembly races, state senate races, and congressional races. And I agree with you that the drawing of district lines is always fought over because it can determine, and is fought over in ethnic racial terms as well. Meanwhile, however, a lot of the big issues are the issues on which Hispanics, African Americans, all kinds of Hispanic, Dominicans, Haitians, even Russian Jews, in which they are really united. So, you know, there's no solution to this kind of fractionalism and fighting, but I think it helps if people keep in view the huge stakes that are being settled in the Congress of the United States and by the President as well, who would act differently, who would be a stronger proponent of jobs, a stronger proponent of a repaired safety net if there were more voters from the bottom of the class and racial structure of the United States.
I'm going to take a stab at the question that you posed in terms of what unions can do. In Ohio, in response to the NVRA, we did a lot of studying. In 2006, all of our executive branches went from Republican completely to Democrat. We had a Democratic governor, Democratic Secretary of State. The Democratic Secretary of State put together what she called a Voting Rights Institute, which was an advisory council of voting rights advocates from around the state, because she wanted to hear, she heard about all of the challenges that we had in our state pre-2006. We had a Secretary of State who, wouldn't let you turn in a voter registration form if it was on the wrong weight of paper. All kinds of crazy stuff. He was the co-chair for Bush's re-election campaign. You all heard about
Blackwell.
Yes. So Secretary of State Jennifer Brunner put together the Voting Rights Institute. And one of the things that we talked about was this whole question of why aren't we doing more in terms of, we looked at our statistics in terms of public agencies where voter registration should have been happening under NVRA, and it wasn't happening. And so we compelled our Secretary of State to put together some aggressive pilots in some of our social service agencies and agencies where these voter registrations should have been happening. But we also talked to the unions that represented those workers and told them about this program that we were going to launch. And as a result of that, we were able to increase some of the registrations that were coming out of either the welfare office or the unemployment office or the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and a whole range of things. So one of the things is that when we have good progressive office holders, we should push them to push the envelope as much as they can, much the same way as Republicans push to take away our rights. We should push as hard as we can when we have friendly, candid office holders holding office to do all the things that need to be done to make it easier for the electorate that would vote to advance policies that are good for the majority of us and not the 1%. And so we were able to do some pilots in Ohio under Secretary of State Jennifer Brunner to increase the voter registration at public and social service agencies under the NVRA. And now it's gone back just the opposite, because now we have a different Secretary of State and he's not pushing that anymore.
Can I just make one comment? Well, I work with Project Vote, which has been taking lawsuits with regard to the implementation of NVRA. And what we have found, and some of those lawsuits are also taken by Demos, what we have found is that as soon as you take a lawsuit, implementation escalates. And this is, we're talking about numbers that are much, much larger than the numbers that can be produced by the volunteer voter registration drives, which Florida and other places want to restrict. This is big time stuff, and it could change the shape of the American electorate.
There's a question there, and then we'll take the second one behind you.
My name's Desma Holcomb, and I'm teaching a class on issues in union organizing. We're all here. And so I wanted to ask you to comment on the interaction between union organizing and the campaign to enfranchise people, both in terms of how union organizing impacts people's civic participation and involvement in these kind of campaigns, and how these kinds of campaigns could empower people who might also take a step around organizing in a union as well, or just what some of those interplays are or could be?
There's someone behind you. Why don't we take those two together? Right there.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for speaking. I think this is an incredibly important conversation to have in so many ways. My question is, from what you've all described, from history and just my knowing, voter disenfranchisement is not a new story or a new mechanism of state repression. So I'm curious, it seems like there's a lot of organizing and coalition building on a local level, and like legally to fight these battles, because statewide it happens at a state level. But it seems like there's a lack of a conversation at a national level, and I was curious what your thoughts were on that, and if there's a need for that, if there's a need for like this conversation to be bigger and to be more transformative, because it's unbelievable that this is part of American culture and it's so acceptable, and it's so broadly acceptable. People don't blink an eye at the fact that their vote doesn't mean anything. So just curious.
Okay, why don't we get responses to those two?
Well, I mean, there are two different problems. One is that when they get to vote, it doesn't mean much, and the other is that they don't get to vote. I think that there is more of a conversation about voter suppression today than I have seen in the very long time that I've been working on the problem, since 1982. So there's the beginning of a national conversation about it. It could, of course, fade. As for the relationship between unions and organizing, I don't think that there's a general answer to that question. There's no sort of one-to-one relationship between union activism or union membership and other kinds of organizing. It's obvious that the unions will be better off if we can reverse the Tea Party dominance of the House of Representatives. Already, by the way, the unions are better off with the new appointees to the NLRB. The Obama presidency is by no means a waste.
I think in terms of the intersection of union organizing and the enfranchisement of voters, I think we got a ways to go. We're not automatically there. And again, I have to keep going back to the Issue 2 campaign of 2011 in Ohio. As big as that campaign was, it was very challenging when the voter suppression bills got introduced in the legislature and then ultimately got signed into law. We literally had to kind of bring the unions along to aggressively oppose the legislation and then ultimately work to help get the signatures that were needed for that. Now, it's kind of weird because it's kind of self-interest, right? Because we knew that if the law stood as was passed, it was going to have an impact on the other issue, the union issue that was on the ballot at the time, the defeat or repeal of Senate Bill 5. And so, unfortunately, it was in their self-interest to engage in this whole voter suppression discussion. I was probably the most vocal on saying, hey, you guys, wake up. This is, you want others to stand with you because your rights are being abridged on the job. What about these voters whose rights are being abridged? So unions are not quite there in terms of the whole union piece and what does that mean in terms of, voter rights and voter enfranchisement. And we're going to tease it out a little bit if as we move toward this campaign that's going to be on the ballot in 2012. We have a lot of work to do to bring the union movement along with fighting and working to defeat or to repeal House Bill 194 that will be on the ballot. Because most folks think it's just for those poor minority folks, and folks aren't really waking up to the fact that when they cut out early voting, it wasn't, I mean, they didn't say, okay, union people, y'all get to vote all the days, and minorities, you all don't. And so, you know, once they understood that there was going to be an impact to them, then they kind of got on board, but it wasn't something that happened automatically.
I'm going to throw in my 2 cents to the second question. You know, I think it was interesting that all of us, you know, had some sort of history component in the way we addressed this issue. And I think maybe the reason for that is that, you know, it's very hard, I think, for most Americans to consider the possibility that what's going on now is more than sort of tinkering around the edges. You know, that you know, we have such a strong belief that the history of our country is towards more democracy. You know, and that, you know, of course, everyone believes in universal suffrage. You know, some of us have different views about how important fraud is, or we may have some disagreements about whether this or that should be right. But of course, we all share this. I'm sorry we missed the clips, because I think it's actually fairly unusual for someone to stand up and say, I don't really believe that it's better to have more people vote, you know. But history shows that, you know, you can have, and we have had, not tinkering around the edges, but real, you know, successful efforts to take large parts of whole social groups out of the electoral process, and that has had disastrous effects on their daily lives. You know, nothing shows that more than the story of African Americans in the South losing the vote after Reconstruction. So I think these conversations are really important, because unless Americans really see that this is not an argument about technical, you know, rules that may help one party more than another, but really potentially is a move away from the basic idea of a democratic society, you know, they're not going to get all that involved. You know, they're not going to get all that concerned. But that may be what we're seeing. So I think that showing people this has happened in our past maybe is one way to get that national conversation going.
If I can just add one point to that. One thing that, I mean, I'm very actually encouraged by the conversation that I think is taking place nationally about photo ID laws and the like. But one thing we don't talk about as much, and that's why I wanted to include at least one slide on it in my presentation, is disenfranchisement of people with criminal convictions, and just the sheer magnitude that really has on our society. There are 5 million people who can't cast the right to vote because of a criminal conviction. 40% of them are African American. Now, let's just talk about, exclude the people who are already out of prison. Let's just talk about the 2 million people who are in prison. If you put them together, now these people are counted. I think this is something that I think is really interesting. These people are counted for the purposes of allocating political representation, right? So if you have a lot of prisons, yeah, if you have a lot of prisons in a particular area, that area is going to get outsized political influence as a result of that. And it's not a small matter. These 2 million individuals who are incarcerated, if you put them together, their population would be larger than our 3 smallest states combined. They would be larger than our 15 smallest states, and they'd have 6 votes in the Electoral College, right? So the level of disenfranchisement we're talking about is nothing minor.
More questions? One. Someone with a mic. Get to this gentleman, and then we have in the back.
Hi, I'm David Kranz, and I'm a student at the Murphy Institute, and also a longtime member of 1199. And from everything I'm hearing, I know that the task before us is to effectively organize on this question. However, given, Mr. Ho, that you said that there is litigation, and Francis, you talked about also how at least the threat of a lawsuit in one context can actually be helpful. I'd like to get an understanding, given what Francis said, that this has always been in our history. What's the basis, and is there any real chance of success legally to challenge any of these laws, and if so, which ones do we have a realistic chance to actually win a legal battle, and then which ones do we have a realistic chance to use the lawsuit, even if we can't win the lawsuit, to affect change? It'd be good to have because often workers, the first impulse is, in 1199, there's outrage that we should be able to go to the court, so at least it'd be good to at least be clear of what the courts can do and what they can't do.
Okay. Let's get a second question, Bill.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Fran's point about the unions and the response. She referred to it desultory. I mean, it was outright hostile. We don't want another stinking piece of paper that we have to do. And I think that there's a historical line that we have to look at. I mean, in the 60s, the workers in the social services bureaucracy were advocates for the population that they were serving. And it got to the point where 15 years ago, I want to say, that they saw the populations they were serving as their enemy. And they didn't see that linkage at all. Now, the question that I'm wondering about is, in the aftermath of such things as Occupy Wall Street, have we maybe come around and understood a little bit more that we do have common cause there?
Okay. So both questions to our panel.
Maybe I could just touch on the litigation question. I want to make very clear that I don't see litigation as the one-size-fits-all solution to all of our problems, or even the most effective tool in the kit. It's what I can talk about because I'm a lawyer and I'm not an organizer, so I can't talk about effective strategies for organization. I'm ill-suited to talk about that. But with respect to litigation, here are some of the tools in the kit. Section 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act requires certain states that have a history of discrimination, before they implement any changes to their voting laws, to obtain approval from the federal government before doing so. So the South Carolina photo ID law, the Texas photo ID law, these are things that actually have to be approved by the federal government before they can go into effect. These were laws that were passed last year, but they're not in effect yet. And they're going to be the subject of litigation in federal court in Washington, D.C. The case that I'm litigating in Florida right now, where I talked about all the changes to Florida's voting laws, it's also being litigated under that same provision of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Now, that's one tool in the kit, but it's also not one that has national application because only certain states have that burden. So Ohio, for instance, doesn't have to get approval from the federal government. Wisconsin doesn't have to get approval from the federal government before implementing its photo ID laws. So that's another challenge. Now, there are other constitutional and statutory provisions that you can bring lawsuits under to challenge some of these laws, but it's harder in places that aren't covered by Section 5 because in these southern states that are covered by Section 5, the burden of proof is on the jurisdiction itself to show that these laws are not discriminatory, whereas in Ohio or Wisconsin, if you want to challenge that law as a plaintiff, the burden of proof is going to be on you to show that these laws are discriminatory. So it's definitely much more challenging in other places than it is in parts of the South.
I just want to add a deep source of unease about the cases that Dale referred to, which is the possibility that the Supreme Court is looking for an excuse to knock out Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, so that it's a little bit hairy because of the character of the court. But, I think that Bill is right, that a lot of the members of the unions that work in these agencies that serve poor and disabled people have developed a kind of animus toward their clients. I think that union leadership has, at least the union leaders that I talk to, and of course not anyone who is here, the union leaders I talked to about NVRA, and I made a real effort at the time of the passage of the legislation, were not prepared to do battle with that prejudice, antagonism, because they didn't want to be charged with asking their members to do still more work when members were not delighted with the contracts that they were getting. But, come on, a lot, as Bill suggested, a lot has happened since then. These are public sector unions. This is CWA. This is 1199. This is District Council 37. These are the unions that are really under assault from these right-wing legislatures. Isn't it a natural that they would try to implement a law that could bring masses of poor people into the electorate and defeat these sons of bitches? I mean, I don't understand. There's no initiative whatsoever?
If you're at the last word, start from the top.
I'm all for the initiative. No, I think, again, for us in Ohio, we really had a teachable moment. The issue is whether or not we can sustain the momentum that we actually saw in terms of the kind of campaign that we waged against collective bargaining rights, and whether or not we can continue to engage in the kind of coalition that we had that reaches outside of just the unions and our own self-interest of just representing workers, and establishing a more broader view of what we need to do in order to grow and or to sustain ourselves. I mean, we have got to, right now, we had literally of the 1.3 million people who signed the petition, we've got to find a way to continue to keep those folks engaged around this whole question. I mean, they got involved not because they were public sector workers, or in some instances, not because they had a family member. A lot of them didn't know that they had even an issue. A lot of them didn't believe that they had any, that this issue had any impact on them. We went out to them and talked to them we talked to African American pastors about the passage, the migration from the south to the north, and how they came north and they got good manufacturing jobs, and those jobs are no longer there. And the public sector was the second sector that helped many of their congregants into the middle class. And we had that conversation with them, but we've got to continue to have those conversations on common ground where folks that are not in unions, because again, 88% of folks are not in a union, we got to have those conversations on common grounds about a lot of issues and not just workplace issues, and maybe try to reshape and recast the question, not a question of adding more work to the poor public sector worker in the agency, but is having a conversation about expanding our democracy, and not, look at it necessarily through the prism of unions and what they have to do for their members, but for all of us here, the 99% of us who really have no place in American politics at this point, no voice in it anyway.
I need to bring this to an end. I'm sure we could go much longer, but many of you have other commitments. So I just want to thank our panelists for a terrific presentation, and our audience as well. Thank you all very much.